vanishing folklore and beliefs. Stories of Old Greece and Rome, Part 8. Diana. During the childhood of Apollo and Diana, the goddess Latona lived happily on the island of Delos, and forgot all her early misfortunes through the joy of her children. As they grew up, she boasted of their strength and of their beauty to all who came to the shores of Delos, and no village or hamlet, however small, but had heard of Latona's children. When Grecian mothers put their little ones to bed at night, they told wonderful tales of an island far out at sea, where a brother and sister lived who were fairer than all the flowers in the meadows, and maidens sighing for a loveliness greater than their own, wove garlands to adorn the shrines of those two who walked the earth in all of their immortal grace. Latona was proud of her children's frame and boasted of it far and wide. Few mothers cared to dispute her claim, and these spoke only in whispers. But there was one, bolder than the rest, who openly laughed at the goddess's boast and taunted her. She taunted her with having but two such children whom she could praise. This was Niobe, a Grecian princess, and the mother of 14 children, 7 sons and 7 daughters, all of them fair and strong, and godlike in spite of their mortal birth. When Niobe learned that the people in her kingdom were loud in their praises of Latona's children, and were neglecting to honor her own splendid sons and daughters, she was very angry, and ordered all the statues of Apollo and Diana to be destroyed. For the people in their devotion to beauty had set up many in the temples and the marketplaces. Then she bade a messenger to go tell the goddess what had been done, and to show her in what contempt the mother of 14 children held her who had but 2 children. When Latona received the message, she was so enraged at the insult that her desire for revenge knew no bounds. She called Apollo and Diana to her side and commanded them to go forth and slay the children of Niobe. It was easy for Apollo to accomplish his part of the cruel task, for he met the 7 sons of Niobe hunting and slew them so quickly that not one of the brothers had time to ask what he had done to merit the god's wrath. The daughters of Niobe were in the palace with their mother, but this did not daunt the young Diana, who put 7 sharp arrows in her quiver and bow in her hand, and went forth to complete Latona's revenge. She found the maidens seated at Niobe's side, weaving, and one by one the remorseless goddess shot them down in spite of their mother's heartbroken cries for mercy. Finding that her entreaties were in vain, and seeing 6 of her daughters lying dead, the distracted Niobe sought to shield the remaining one with her own body, while she prayed wildly to the gods to spare her this one last child. But the gods were deaf to her cries, and Diana, fitting the last arrow to her bow, shot the maiden as she cowered in her mother's arms. Over her fallen body the wretched Niobe wept so long that the gods at last felt pity for her grief and changed her into stone. The statue was placed by a running stream, and ever afterwards the waters were fed by the tears that continued to course down the cheeks of the stone statue, and travelers came from foreign lands to gaze on this wonderful marvel of a devoted mother who could not cease crying and mourning for her two children, even when turned into stone. Though the goddess Diana spent most of her daylight hours in hunting, it was not often that she exercised her skill to such cruel purpose, as was shown in the poor case of Niobe. Wherever the wild deer roamed and the pathless forest knew no touch of a woodsman's axe, there Diana, fleet-footed and tireless, followed the chase. As soon as the flaming chariot of the sun threw its first streak of light across the hills, the goddess donned her short tunic and, armed with her golden bow and quiver, set out with her bands of nymphs for the day's hunt. At noontide, wearied with the chase, she sought out some secluded spot where the mountain stream ran clear and where the foliage hung round her like a curtain. On a certain day, when she and her maidens were enjoying the refreshing coolness of the water, they heard a slight rustle among the trees, and looking around perceived a young hunter watching them. This was Actæon, who had himself been following the deer since daybreak, and had been drawn to the spot by the noise of running water. As he neared the stream, he heard sounds of girlish laughter, and this so roused his curiosity that he hastily put aside the branches to see who the merrymakers might be. Great was his dismay when he recognized Diana in her nymphs. But before he could disappear among the bushes, the goddess saw him, and catching up some water in her hand, she threw it into his face, crying, "Go, now if you can, and say that you have seen Diana at her bath." The moment these words were spoken, Actæon felt a queer change coming over him, and he stared in horror at his hands and feet, which were turning into hooves, and at his skin, which was rapidly changing into a deer's hide. Antlers grew out of his head, and he dropped on all fours, and found himself turned into a stag. Before he quite realized what had befallen him, he heard the baying of hunting hounds, and knew that his only safety was in flight. He dashed off through the bushes, but the dogs were on his track. Before he had gone far, the pack had overtaken him, since he knew no lore of the wild things by which they elude their enemies, and they were snapping and snarling at his throat. Deprived of his human voice, he could not cry for help, and in a moment the hunting hounds had torn him into pieces. And so was Diana, and so was Diana avenged. There was another young hunter who encountered Diana and her maidens in the woods, but he met with a kinder fate at the hands of the goddess than poor Actæon, whose only fault had been a most natural curiosity. The fleet-footed Diana was no more ardent in the chase than was the hunter Orion, who roamed the forest all day with his faithful dog Sirius. One morning, as he rushed eagerly through the woods in pursuit of a deer, he came suddenly upon the 7 Pleiades, nymphs of Diana, who were resting after a long and arduous hunt at daybreak. Charmed with their beauty, Orion drew nearer, but the maidens, terrified at his outstretched arms, fled away through the forest. Undaunted by the remembrance of Actæon's fate, The hunter pursued the flying nymphs, determined that so much beauty should not escape him. Seeing that he was gaining on them in spite of their swift feet, the maidens called upon Diana for help, and were at once changed into 7 white pigeons, which flew up into the heavens before Orion's astonished eyes. Some time later, these same Pleiades became 7 bright stars, and were set as a constellation in the sky. There they have remained ever since. Orion continued to hunt from early dawn until nightfall, without any misfortune overtaking him on account of his impetuous love-making. On the contrary, his ardor evidently found favor with the goddess Diana, for one day, when he unexpectedly met her alone in the forest, she smiled graciously upon him and offered to share the day's sport with him. Perhaps it was the beauty of the young hunter as well as his boldness that charmed the goddess. But however that may be, she continued to meet him in the forest, and they hunted together hour after hour until twilight began to fall. Then Diana knew that she must leave her lover and mount her silver chariot of the moon. When Apollo learned of his sister's affection for the young hunter, he was very angry, for Diana had refused the love of the gods and had begged of Jupiter the right to live unwed. The sun god determined therefore to put an end to Orion's wooing, and so he waited at the shadowy portals of the west until Diana, her nightly journey over, descended from her silver chariot and threw the reins on the necks of her wearied steeds. And then Apollo spoke to his sister of her hunting and praised her skill with her bow. Presently he pointed to a tiny speck that was rising and falling on the crest of the waves of a long distance away, and bidding her use this as a target, he challenged her to prove her skill. Diana, suspecting no treachery, fitted an arrow into her bow and let it fly with unerring aim. Great was her distress when she learned what her brother's trickery had led her to, for it was no floating log or bit of seaweed that her arrow had pierced, but the body of Orion. Apollo had seen the hunter go each morning to the ocean to bathe, and he thought this was an easy way to dispose of the unworthy lover. Diana mourned Orion many days, and to keep his memory honored, she placed him and his faithful dog Sirius in the sky as constellations of stars.